This entire week we've been talking about the domination cycle and how it works. The first video we talked about the dominant and the dominated groups. The dominant are the people who are in charge or are dominant over any choices and over the culture itself. Well, as the dominated are kind of the outsiders and treated lower. They are literally the people that take on the crap jobs. And the dominant dominated thing isn't purely in the minds of the people themselves. If they were to be seen from an outsider, it wouldn't make any sense to them. But to the minds of the people involved, there is a order, and these people are in charge, and these people are not. Then we went through what the cycle is like, where at first the dominant are completely in charge. They give only crap jobs to the crappy people, and they think nothing of it. And they have kind of this narrative that they are in charge, and the people doing this are obviously stupid, and we don't need to worry about them. They go on with their petty little battles, or they get on with their battles, and then they have those that they are dominant over battle amongst each other as a way to kind of control them. Unfortunately for the dominant, they tend to lose ground, and as they lose ground, they start to give it more and more to the dominated groups. And then slowly there's a buffer period, and during this buffer period, the chance of equalization or even a switch happens. Unfortunately, during this time, nobody really notices because it's the buffer period until it is obvious, blatantly obvious, and they've all been given some time to look at it. They don't notice, but after they notice it, everything changes. The narrative changes. The concepts and ideas change, and I've explained how the Chinese have been viewed as dominant to dominated to dominant to dominated to now dominant again, and that's just been a way the Europeans have viewed them for centuries. It's not a one, this year they view them this way, this year they view them that way. It is a slow cycle, and we don't really notice it very often. So this video is asking the questions of why it isn't noticed. Why aren't people noticing this obvious thing happening right in front of them? And it gets into kind of the more specifics of why aren't people noticing that the online world is taking over? Why aren't people noticing that video games are becoming a mainstream entertainment source? And also, why does it feel like we're caught between two worlds right now, between that of the world of walls and rules and that of the world of trade and communication? Well, we'll get into that right now. Sorry. The first thing we have to understand is the deified self. And the deified self amongst the dominant group is that they are dominant. And it isn't just dominant in, that they're better. It's that they are gods to the other people. They view themselves in a way that makes them greater than anybody else. And yes, this is Captain America. I just saw the Avengers movie, and it was really cool. Sad, but cool. But I've noticed that just about every shot of Captain America we have just makes him look very dignified. And that's kind of the idea. When you watch a movie and the good guy does something, they have kind of this dignity to him. And in our minds, we are the good guys. We are the ones who are doing the dignified things. And the evil people, the lesser than us, well, they're kind of dirty a little. They're kind of scroungy a little. They're not perfect. And that's where we come in, where we say, we are better. We are perfect. We have greater understanding than these people over here. Obviously, they do not understand, or they do not, get these ideas. So if they were to take over, that would be completely impossible because they're idiots. And so this deified self kind of kicks in, where you view yourself as greater than even how you actually view, or you view your people as greater than how you might view yourself. You know that you're imperfect and that you make mistakes and that you got all these screw-ups. But in your mind, you're like, but I'm part of these people and they are greater than, such and such, which isn't true. But we do it all the time. And then we have a reality where the new paradigm has the dominant group as kind of outsiders, whereas in the former time, they were insiders. They were the major insiders. They were the people, who made decisions and who did all the things. And in their minds, they are so dominant. And so they cannot see that they are the outsiders who don't understand what's going on and don't understand the culture that's taking over. To them, the new people are the outsiders and are the people who are doing all this weird stuff. And it just doesn't make any sense to them that this is happening. In another sense, they are the outsiders, and the people who are taking over just can't understand how the dominant, who are these incredibly intelligent people, don't seem to be getting the obvious things. And it just boggles their mind that such a thing could possibly be happening. Because, here's these people who are the center of our culture, and yet they don't get it. And it's weird. And so that's a reality that we don't quite accept. Then we have the narrative that the dominant have always been in power. This is I'm going to say 16th century picture of a cannon using triangulation. Speaking of which, trigonometry was actually a protected mathematic formula back in the day for France. They would use that to fire their cannonballs better. And because of that, they won a lot of wars. But you have to realize that in their minds, in our minds today, we see this cannon, and in our minds, we see how we have dominated the entire landscape. We dominated because we built the cannon, we built the gun, we built, all these things. We brought diseases. Oh, those diseases have destroyed them. Obviously, we are smarter than them. We are greater than them. We have outsmarted them, and we have built guns. We are big and powerful, and we have always been in power. There is no way that this other group can understand the size of what they are dealing with. Oh my goodness, our people are deified and have always been in power. And, there's a certain amount of truth to this. The cannon was useful in many battles. Although, if I were to be honest with you, the cannon until, I couldn't even give you the right date here, of 17th century, and even then, cannons weren't really used very well for most of the time that they were invented. Yes, they could, take down a wall, but for the most part, they didn't use them in, aiming and, proper taking of, charging forces. They just kind of used them to kind of scare people off, but they were wholly inaccurate. And honestly, when people went to war, they were expecting both the people firing the cannons and the people being fired at to have an equal amount of death. Quite a few stories of people just losing their arms because their gun just exploded in their hands. But the people in charge didn't care because they were like, yeah, well, I won the war, so therefore it doesn't matter. And you would have hundreds of thousands of people going against hundreds of thousands of people, and in the minds of the leaders, it didn't matter. And oh man, it caused all sorts of problems. Speaking of which, most of those people are no longer in power. Not even close to power. But in our minds, that cannon transitioned over to the people who held the cannons, even though they were the ones equally getting blown up. That's just kind of how the narrative goes. We switch the narrative a little so that the cannon becomes, our power. The automobile becomes our power. The sailboat becomes our power. And we don't realize that it wasn't always used perfectly, and it wasn't until recent times that quite often these things weren't very useful. But it creates a narrative for us, and it becomes difficult to get out of the narrative and go, no, we haven't always been in power. There have been times where we were the wusses, and we kind of gained power through these other methods. We just can't seem to accept that. We want to say that we gained power by being powerful. And that is a difficult pill to take when you find out that you weren't. And then there's a sense of false control. And the reason why is once you believe that you are in control or that you have the power, you stop thinking about it in a conscious way. It starts becoming an unconscious thought. You see somebody that is lower than you, you immediately, reflexively think, oh, that person is lower than me. You don't think about it. You're not giving any conscious thought. You just go, oh, ugly. Oh, less than me. And this is actually part of our mind's way of, keeping all of our concentration points down a little bit, because reflex is doing very, very, very complex controls, because it's already been done. So they kind of create a subgroup and go, oh, this is the subgroup on who those people are. Those people are lesser than me. I don't need to remember their faces. I don't need to remember who they are. I don't need to remember anything about them. They are unimportant because they are less than me. So you immediately take them and you just toss them away. And this sense of false control is a common thing, I find it hilarious when friends of mine and I go to places and everybody's like, oh, isn't it great that you helped your friends get into such and such place? And I'm like, actually, they're the ones paying. I'm the poor guy. But it just doesn't enter into some people's minds because the people I'm with are considered lesser. And they do not register in their minds that it's possible for me to be the poor guy or to be the dominated in this situation. Because of that, we create this false sense of control, where because they are lesser than us and we have deified ourselves, we have control over them in great ways, and it's just become a reflex to us, and we don't recognize it as much as we want to admit. And then we have the guilt of domination, and this is where we actually consciously think about it, but because we've already reflexively thought, well, I am dominant, I am greater than them, I have always been in power, I have done all these things, and you don't even, it's become just this thing for you, and you see somebody and they kind of reference that person in a way that fits our stereotype, we have this guilt of domination. This is actually when these groups are actually starting to gain a little bit more power, a little bit more cultural. Dang it, I thought I had Do Not Disturb on. Crap. But this happens when you believe you have more cultural power and that you've always been in power. And that poor, impoverished Native American, he's suffering so much. By the way, that guy isn't Native American, he's Italian. Seriously, he was born in Italy, and he played this character most of the rest of his life, and most of the natives were like, he's not even dressed like us. But it becomes this kind of awkward conversation where people would pretend to be native to get special treatment. And this guilt of domination is where you feel that you need to pay back for some kind of thing that happened that you believe you overpowered them with. And it may have happened, but usually it's several generations ago, and it had nothing to do with you, or nothing to do with your friendship, and nothing to do with what either of you are doing at the moment. But because neither of you have accepted that you're reflexively responding to this, and that you are associating yourself with more power than you really have, then you start to have this guilt complex. Here's this person who is smart, intelligent, going to school, he has a lot of cultural authority now. What can I do? I mean, he's proven that he isn't stupid or any of the stereotypes I've given to him. Obviously, me having power over him is this horrible thing. Now, what's really weird is you don't get rid of the stereotypes, and I think that's hilarious. In fact, some of the stereotypes are even strengthened a little, and in both groups. The dominated want to kind of strengthen these stereotypes, and it becomes awkward when they find out that no, that wasn't actually a thing for their culture. As a German, I got to tell you that I don't know how to say hello in German. I know how to say hello to my family. I know how to say hello to friends, but I don't know how to say hello to a common German. And the only stereotypes I've got are, frankly, National Socialistic stereotypes. And, I have to actually watch myself. I've clicked my heels because I'm stupid. But no, it's because I don't have that thing in my culture, or I haven't experienced it. And I can only use what I know. And unfortunately, what I know is a horrible stereotype. And so we keep these stereotypes because we don't have the right information to take care of it. And, if somebody were to see this, they'd be like, oh, that poor person, he actually, no, they wouldn't say that poor person. They'd be like, oh, Nazi. But really, it's just me trying to say hello and I don't know how. Being awkward is a real problem. But this guilt of domination, you'll see it all over when a group is starting to get power. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, the Irish started to gain power. The Italians started to gain power. The Jews started to gain power. And they started to have a lot of influence in the groups that they were in, and they had a cultural influence outside of themselves, outside of their cultural groups. And they started to, really gain power in, movies and TV and stuff like that. And suddenly we had, all these stories about how the Irish were held down and treated like slaves. And, I'm not going to disagree. They were indentured servants at times. And, these horrible things did happen to them. But this was sort of a way to demand reparations. It's one of the reasons why we celebrate St. Patrick's Day. It has nothing to do with St. Patrick. It has everything to do with us celebrating a stereotype in our mind of what the Irish are like, even though the Irish themselves aren't really like that, unless you read Gaelic, or Irish Gaelic anyway. But that's kind of a thing in our minds, is we can't give up the stereotype, so we feel guilty for what's happening to this obviously intelligent person, and we can't quite get rid of that stereotype, which is a reflex in our mind. It's difficult to give up a reflex. If I were to throw a ball at you and you've been training your entire life to catch that ball, it's difficult to not catch the ball. You have to consciously do that. And then on the other side, we have kind of this want for revenge. And this is a little bit later, when the two cultures have started to really gain some power on each other, started to equalize, and you're in this buffer period. You'll have this guilt of domination, and then the other group will have this want for revenge. They see they have power, and it could be an interesting case where, it's not that they always have power or they always have influence. It's just at this moment you are now surrounded by people who are accustomed to being dominated, but now they have the power for this moment, and they want for revenge. They want revenge, and in their minds, oh, you're the dominated one. You have had all this power. You have reflexively taught. We have had to deal with this reflex where we think we're dominated by you, or that you're dominant over us, or that you're better than us. You're not deified. You're human, and they kind of reject you in a way that means that they can hurt you, and this causes some insanity. I'm going to tell you the truth. I have been in several tribal groups, and most of them couldn't care less about Christopher Columbus. They don't. They're more worried about, am I going to get food? Am I going to get water? Hey, what's on TV? Stuff like that. Or how can I, raise more awareness about my culture? If they do think about that. But there is small groups that want revenge. And, yeesh. Go away. And because of this narrative of always in power, they go all the way back to Christopher Columbus, who barely had anything to do with, control in the Americas, and just blame him for everything. You'll notice in this thing, they call him 500 years of tourism. And yeah, in their minds, once they have the power, they're going to kick us all out. This is in their minds. And, we have this guilt of domination, and they have a want for revenge. And this can create some real tricky moments where you have to be like, no, you can't get revenge on me because of something that happened 500 years ago. And if you do, you will be just as guilty as whoever did that 500 years ago. And they just can't accept this. And in case you're wondering, national groups, nations, nationalism, it actually specifically uses want for revenge as a way to gain power. They will point at people and be like, look at this person. Obviously, he is not acting as the deified self. He is not doing the righteous things. And you know what? He has dominated us for years. but he has not truly dominated us. He is vile. It is time to get revenge. And some horrifying things happened last century because of that. And it was purely nationalism doing this, using this want for revenge to gain power. Because as you were gaining revenge, or as you were committing your revenge, you were silencing anybody that would speak against you. And you were gaining more cultural power. But the only cultural power you had was hate. And, just there are people out there like this in every culture, in every group you will find people who want revenge. And sometimes they don't mean it. And other times, oh, for crying out loud, they do. And it's difficult to talk about. And I couldn't find a proper picture of this, but I am going to reference in the Philippines. They have several different groups that have taken over the Philippines. And so the more you look like a more dominant group, the better you are. If you're Chinese, you're obviously rich and a bit more powerful. If you're white, you are super powerful and you obviously have tons of money. And it's treated that way in the Philippines. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying it is a thing. And so a lot of people who are brown or native of the Philippines feel that they have been dominated. And because of this, the Chinese, who have been born and raised have raised children, and then they raise children, and then they raise children, and then they raise children in the Philippines, and they still have this power because of the cultural things going on in everybody's heads. They view brown people in the Philippines as, not undeified. That means kind of demonic. They view them as uncultured, incapable of gaining power because, my group has always had power. And this is happening from both Chinese and white people, in case you're wondering. There was a woman named Amy Jua who wrote about it, and she gives some pretty interesting details where she talks about an aunt who, kicks everybody out because she doesn't want revenge. She doesn't want them to get revenge on her because she's treating them like slaves. And, the culture should have equalized by now, but outside sources want them to continue to fight. Well, this fear of attack means that whenever you recognize that you are you are the dominant group, but you are in an area where you are no longer dominated, or you are no longer dominant, you recognize you are dominated, and it scares the living snot out of you. You recognize that you are in an area where they can get revenge. And you know what? That it's a scary, scary moment when you hear somebody say, "Oh, you're that. You want revenge." Or no. Yeah, who just wants revenge. And you have to deal with that person. And they can get power. They might have cultural influence around you. And it is a scary thing. And then this kind of stereotype actually spreads back into the dominated group. And they fear, the dominant group. And they work hard to kind of, they'll have this guilt of domination where they view themselves as more powerful. But they will always try to stay away from that group. They'll be like, "Oh, you poor thing, here, you can have this, but, stay away from me." It's almost like they think they're being robbed, but they're not saying it out loud. I've never thought of it that way, but yeah, it's true. And because of this, this fear of attack, from both sides, honestly, they don't realize that it might not be happening anymore, that equality is a possibility. And the dominant group is also afraid of attack because, the dominated group is afraid of being attacked because the dominant have always been in power and they've always been able to use guns or armies or whatever they say they can, and, use their cultural influence to denigrate this group, to not get, special things or cultural artifacts or anything else that they can think of. And they're just scared of this kind of reprisal from the dominant group. And so they actually create these very thick walls between themselves and the dominant. And whenever they mix, they actually start checking to see who has more people and why and how does this work. And it's kind of ridiculous at times. because honestly, they should work together. And I'll give you an example. Uh, I'm going to give you a new narrative. When I was in high school, I went to a ghetto high school. And honestly, the reason why I went to this high school was they were the only ones with a gifted program. And there were places where people did not want us to go in. I mean, stores. I mean, there was a mall that was maybe half a mile away. And, I'd walk there and I'd hang out. And honestly, the only stores left after a certain point were the geek stores, were the stores perfect for teenagers who go to high school. And everybody there kind of disliked us. And they would go to, the city council and be like, you need to get rid of these teenagers. They are scaring people. They are bothering people. Oh my gosh. Do they not understand that we are the dominant ones and they are dominated? And they kicked us out. It was very difficult to get stuff done. And the mall actually went under because we were their only customers. They wanted for more richer customers and stuff. They still do, in fact. But they never gained that because they never actually took in any customers. Nobody was actually achieving the deified self. And because of that, the dominant group went under. They actually killed their own jobs. And yeah, there's a lot of stupid city council stuff going on here, but that's a pretty good outline. There were literal times where we were told, maybe you should just stop going there and they'll figure out that you're their source of income. And we didn't listen because we had nowhere else to go. And, it just slowly happened where you watched the mall just die because they weren't willing to take on customers. And yeah, it was weird to watch because that mall isn't there anymore, but you know what? The high school still is. And that's one of those things where the new narrative shows that that mall doesn't matter, but the high school does. And that's part of the thing that we don't recognize is often because we're giving the crap jobs to these people, or because the dominated group is viewing themselves as so important and so in power and so in control that it's become a reflex. They don't recognize when they do have a narrative change, and that the narrative change might be these people are no longer important to the culture at large. Let's take malls in general. They were designed to be this hyper-real place for us to go into, and we would go into them and we would kind of have a Disneyland moment where, oh, that area right there, that's my culture. Oh, that area right there, oh, that's something I like. I'm going to ignore everything else, but I'm going to go to the places I like. And the mall was kind of this place where teenagers could go and, people could go and they could go shopping. And it was kind of this event to go to the shopping mall. And then, the internet came out and Amazon came out, and Amazon came out with clothing at one point. And the store's immediate response was, well, you can never, try these clothes on. You can never understand how these clothes work. So, they totally didn't see Amazon as a threat. And now almost every single one of those stores is gone. And that's the thing. They viewed themselves as dominant to the point that it became a reflex. They viewed what they did in a deified sense. They raised it above their own selves. They thought there's no way JCPenney could go under. It's about to declare bankruptcy. Obviously, they just don't register in their minds that little phone thing that they're complaining about might be what's destroying them, and they're not willing to recognize it as that, or to adapt to it. It's actually fascinating because this is going to sound really weird to you. Arcades are actually coming back. They're showing up in those same areas more and more, and they're making plenty of money. They're doing well. So obviously an arcade is not an evil thing. But in the minds of anybody you talk to who's in retail, arcades are dead because, the console took over. And so now they only have console stores in malls for the most part. There's quite a few exceptions. I'm not going to deny that. But if you go to those arcade owners and you talk about it, they'll be like, honestly, this narrative is crap. we're doing better than we did 8 years ago. And in Seattle, it's very much so the opposite of whatever the narrative was beforehand, where the arcade was dying because of consoles. Now you go to an arcade for the cultural experience, and because they've got games that you simply can't experience somewhere else, and because of that, people go to the arcade. Even if you own a bunch of games, you go to the arcade because there's the camaraderie and the chance to play with friends and others. And this becomes a change in the narrative for what the arcade was for, or what, video games are about, or what retail is useful. And this new narrative changes the dominant group, the malls and those groups who view themselves so highly as outsiders. And these outsiders are unwilling to accept this change because it's now just in their heads as a reflex that they are in charge. And it's very, very difficult for them to overcome this. In the same way that many times we see, not just video games, but how do we put this? A market that nobody really considers because that market wasn't important or wasn't being covered very well. The Clayton Christensen, when he studied it, he used memory for computers. And he said, okay, look, see, we had this type of memory, then we switched over to this type of memory, and this type of memory, and then this memory. There's this obvious scale here. But every time somebody from this kind of computer company tried to sell the new kind of technology out, nobody would buy it because they only sold to their old buyers. They viewed themselves as important, and obviously their buyers were, the important people. So they didn't need to sell to these new people. And almost every single time, these companies would disappear. And that's the reason why the new narrative is so difficult to accept. It's just difficult to see it. So I think I've rambled on a little bit, but it's okay. You can see everything. You've looked at the equation a little bit. You've seen the bomb system that I set up, and you've seen how everything kind of works. So next week, we're going to talk about how there are places where geeks can meet and the reasons why sometimes the narrative doesn't work in the way everybody's giving it. And I'll show you some examples. I found this really cool place in Bremerton, so I want to talk about it. But starting in May, we're going to be talking about how conventions work and why they work, and what happens when conventions get so popular that they start to raise the amount of things that people are doing to the point that they might actually destroy themselves. So we're going to get into that a lot more for the month of May, and then starting in June, in June, I'm pretty much going to be almost entirely about the conventions I'm working at. So catch you all later, and bye now.